Hello, boys and girls. Today we're gonna talk about homeless people throwing all their money into the sea. Cynicism. What is it? Should I cash all my savings and burn them in a parking lot? What is cynicism in a nutshell? In the beginning, there was Socrates. He had many students. The most prominent of them were Xenophon, Plato, and Antisthenes. It seems they didn't like each other much, although, from the sources we have, it is probable that Xenophon was quite sympathetic towards Antisthenes. In any case, these three people went separate ways. Xenophon became a prominent and surprisingly influential historian. Plato became a god, and Antisthenes inspired people to become bums.
Where the bombs go, whoa! Where the bombs go, whoa!
Antisthenes is sometimes considered a founder of Cynicism, or at least the most important precursor. But he was overshadowed by his two highly eccentric followers, Diogenes of Sinope and Crates of Thebes. These are the most well-known names in the history of Cynicism, the ancient Cynics. Later periods, well, although I started this video in a very funny manner, with jokes and songs, for a while we have to move to the sad and boring part of our story, the sources. Once again, as in the case of Epicurean philosophy, we don't have much. We have some, we know the principal doctrines, we have bits and pieces, we have legends, and the overall number of materials on Cynicism is better compared to Epicureanism. But we certainly don't have enough, partly because not much survived, obviously. Partly because we're talking about essentially, let's put it this way, homeless people. They were not into writing books. For philosophical reasons, for practical reasons, for many reasons. It seems they were into poetry, though. So yeah, we have legends. And these legends are mostly about Diogenes. A reasonably large number of contradicting anecdotes, and the actual Diogenes, in many ways, was lost behind this legendary Diogenes. Diogenes became a myth. We have, as always, and you have to get used to that, Diogenes Laertius and his lives and opinions of eminent philosophers, filled with nice quotes and sometimes not so nice anecdotes. You can read there about Antisthenes, Crates, and about Diogenes. We have certain pieces in analogous books like Stoicism and his anthology. And we have works of the people who wrote something on cynicism, but were not really cynics themselves. Stoics usually, because cynicism and stoicism are related, and we will talk about it very soon. The best two and most valuable examples of these sources are Epictetus, the key figure of the Roman Stoicism, and his contemporary Dio Chrysostom, a hybrid of at least three schools of philosophy. And as some researchers half-jokingly point out, Epictetus was a Stoic who was very much into cynicism, and Dio Chrysostom was mostly a cynic who was very much into Stoicism. And that's about it. So if you somehow need recommendations on what you should read from the ancient authors, well, there are no books by 100% legitimate cynics in existence. You can, once again, read parts from Diogenes Laertius, and you can read nice and profound discourses by the people who were cynics only partially. So, in a way, Discourses of Epictetus is the best book on the philosophy of cynicism. The only problem here is that Epictetus was a Stoic, and his Discourses is a book on the philosophy of Stoicism. That's all very sad. And now to the fun part, because you're probably here for Diogenes, don't you? Legendary ancient cynics. As we already mentioned, Antisthenes is believed to be the main progenitor of cynicism. Antisthenes was a student of famous sophist Gorgias, but then switched to Socrates. The groundwork for cynicism can easily be found in the existing quotes from him, or attributed to him. First of all, just all of the Socratic schools of philosophy, and also Antisthenes and the Cynics, thought that eudaimonia, or happiness, is what they're going for. What is the greatest bliss? Somebody asked Antisthenes. To die happy. No, I'm not quoting from the popular book Top 500 Sayings of the People of Importance. I'm quoting from Diogenes Laertius, which is not much better, really. Okay, happiness. Then we have self-sufficiency. What advantage had he, Antisthenes, gained from philosophy? And Antisthenes goes like, the ability to hold a conversation with myself. Like any Socratic, he obviously followed virtue ethics. He was absolutely sure that virtue can be taught and virtue is sufficient in itself for happiness. Laws of virtue are more important than the established laws. There we can see this ever-going discussion about physis and nomos, the natural law and the law of the people. And living according to nature is one of the fundamentals of cynicism. Antisthenes also used to say that he'd rather be mad than feel pleasure, and stuff like, may the sons of your enemies live in luxury. So, if you were wondering where Diogenes got the inspiration for his eccentricities, it's Antisthenes, his teacher. Antisthenes used to teach in the public gymnasium at a place called Kynosarges, outside the walls of Athens. Kynosarges means white dog, and that's one, but not the only, of the possible explanations how the Cynic school got its name. While we don't know for sure if Antisthenes can be considered the first actual Cynic, his student and follower, Diogenes, was definitely an embodiment and probably the real or mythological founder of Cynicism. Diogenes was born in a city called Sinope, on the territory of the present-day northern Turkey. That's why it is more correct to call him Diogenes of Sinope, to distinguish him from the thousands of other people with the name Diogenes. And probably at least a couple of dozens of them were also philosophers. When he was young, Diogenes visited the oracle at Delphi and asked what he should do. And the oracle told him that he should debase or revalue the currency. And he was like, that's literally what I've been doing the whole time. And indeed, that's literally what he's been doing in his hometown. He worked in the financial sector, and together with his father, he used to debase coins to gain profit. That's exactly why he was kicked out of the city and went to Delphi. On a second thought, he figured out that the oracle meant something that has nothing to do with money, but with values. So he went to Athens, became a student of Antisthenes, and after years of careful preparation, he was quite ready to revalue everything. We don't know if Diogenes actually wrote something. There are contradicting reports. Diogenes Laertius gives a list of his works and then adds that there are opinions that he left nothing in writing. But in any case, his main method wasn't writing. It was provocative actions and witty remarks and harassing people, like Socrates on steroids. That's why, as the legend tells us, Plato once said that Diogenes was a Socrates gone mad. Diogenes pushed the asceticism of Antisthenes to the extremes. He lived more or less the life of a homeless person and occasionally, or maybe most of the time, a beggar. The most famous legend tells that he slept in a large pithos, a storage container made of clay. Basically a barrel. That's why later tradition just simplifies things and says that Diogenes lived in a barrel. He didn't have many possessions. Simple clothes, a bag, and at least for some time a cup and a staff. That was enough for him, since one of the fundamentals of his philosophy was that you don't really need much. So he was consciously limiting himself only to the basic necessities. Obviously, there are lots of sayings of Diogenes traveling around and anecdotes about his stunts, and most probably you've heard many of them. The primary source of all of these stories and quotes is, as you probably know by now, is Diogenes Laertius and his Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers. There are pages of these anecdotes, and any book with famous quotes of the wise people or a website dedicated to quotes, well, they just copy and paste stuff from Diogenes Laertius. If you're into this kind of things, which is absolutely justifiable in the case of Diogenes, because he was quite probably the funniest philosopher ever, just proceed to the source material. It's absolutely free and can be found online in basically like 2 clicks. I don't want to engage in a straightforward copy and paste of the material from Diogenes Laertius and discuss all of the funny stories about our philosopher, but in some ways it is inevitable. So I will limit myself to, say, 3 quotes attributed to Diogenes. Probably not my favorite quotes and not the funniest ones, but the ones that showcase certain ideas of cynicism as a philosophy. The first one will be, "Bad men obey their lusts as servants obey their masters." This is indeed a very important idea of cynicism and of the majority of the Socratic philosophical schools. And this idea is very well articulated in the descendant of cynicism, the Stoic school. Once again, it is a prominent subject for Epictetus, who talks about this kind of servitude and slavery a lot. On being asked what Diogenes had gained from philosophy, he replied, "To be prepared for every fortune." This is another important part of cynicism that logically comes from self-sufficiency. You don't need much, you practically don't need anything except for virtue. And as with all of these philosophical features mentioned up to this point, it can be seen as a direct precursor of one of the principal ideas of Stoicism: determinism with a free will. Don't pay too much attention to the things that are not under your control. And the last of the quotes will be this one. Diogenes was asking for financial aid from a man. And the man said, "Yes, if you can persuade me." And Diogenes was like, "If I could have persuaded you, I would have persuaded you to hang yourself." And this is one of the most important things in the philosophy of the Cynics. You must be able to immediately provide witty remarks. If you can't do it, you're not a real cynic. Diogenes had followers, although due to the nature of his philosophy and his lifestyle, probably not many. The most important and glorified of them was Crates of Thebes, who in many ways was even funnier and smarter than his teacher. Crates was let's call it, a moderate cynic, less shameless and less radical. Compared to Diogenes, Crates was super radical compared to virtually everybody else. At some point, Crates figured out that money just doesn't make sense. And property doesn't really make sense either. Useless stuff. There are different versions on what exactly he did next. The most dominant version is that he sold all of his possessions, and unlike many cynics, he was quite a wealthy man, and then just threw away all of the accumulated money into the sea, and became a bum. Crates was known as the door opener. He was literally breaking into the houses, and then teaching people there some outrageous stuff. It is an exaggeration, I know. Crates was very respected by the community. People listened to him, and he was also seen as a leading expert in marriage counseling. Unlike most of the cynics who maintained that you don't really need a family, Crates was actually married. A sister of one of his students, Mitrocles, fell in love with him and threatened her parents, who were quite wealthy people, that she'd kill herself if they didn't let her marry Crates. Crates tried to discourage her from potentially stupid decisions, since he was an actual wandering bum, and told her that this marriage can only be possible if the girl, her name was Hipparchia, will agree to live as a cynic as well. She agreed, and to everyone's surprise, they lived together for the rest of their lives. So, as you can see from this anecdote, it makes a lot of sense why people thought that a person capable of this sort of tricks knows very well what is important in a marriage and what is not. Crates obviously had his own students, and the most prominent was a guy from Cyprus called Zeno. Zeno became an even more moderate cynic, to a point when he basically ceased to be a cynic. To put things simply, he argued that indeed it is important to live according to nature, meaning physis, not tree hugging. But it is in the nature of a human being to build social structures, create culture, and spread civilization. These are the things that cynics largely ignored as artificial constructs. But for Zeno and his followers, this aspect of culture was immanent to human nature. Because humans are not dogs or pigs. So Zeno became the originator of a family-friendly version of cynicism. But that's the topic of our next video, because this version is called Stoicism. After this period, we don't really know much about any famous cynic philosophers. It is believed that cynicism had some kind of resurgence during the Roman period, but no works of or interesting quotes exist, except, as I mentioned right from the start, the works of Epictetus and Dio Chrysostom. Most of the cynics at this point were seen as a total insult to the noble philosophy, since they were mostly considered just lazy beggars pretending to have a philosophical justification to their lifestyle. The only important actual cynic of this period you can read about, but very briefly, was a guy called Demetrius, or Demetrius the Cynic. He is known for his association with the prominent Stoics of this period. The story goes like this. Seneca, a prominent statesman and a Stoic philosopher, maintained that you'd better have a virtuous person somewhere near you, a person you can ask for guidance and use as a model of a virtuous behavior. That's a very Stoic thing to do, and it is advised that if you can't find this guide, you can imagine some dead Stoic philosopher walking with you and giving you an advice. Anyway, Seneca found an actual living philosopher, not an imagined philosopher, to serve this purpose. And this philosopher was Demetrius, a cynic, because Stoicism and Cynicism are related and more or less compatible. And during the Roman period, some people actually asked questions about what is the difference exactly. So Seneca, a senator, and Demetrius, a bum, lived together and they were close friends. It is reported that Demetrius stayed with Seneca until the very end. And when Seneca asked him to leave, because the famous suicide of Seneca could have bad consequences to Demetrius and could pose a direct threat to his life as a person closely associated with the condemned senator, Demetrius refused to leave him. He just didn't care if he'll get killed. He was doing what he thought was right. He was also a friend of the other dead Stoics of Nero's reign. And the last time we hear from him is probably from Cassius Dio, who has an interesting part in his history book about Vespasian and how the emperor kicked out all of the philosophers from the city of Rome, including Demetrius. And surprisingly, except for Gaius Musonius Rufus. The main concern for Vespasian, that's the opinion of Cassius Dio, not mine. The main concern was that the Stoics, because, and I quote, they were taking advantage of the name of philosophy to teach publicly many doctrines inappropriate to the times. Also, they look down upon everybody, and they are full of empty boasting. And the primary example of this Stoic given by Cassius Dio was, well, Demetrius the Cynic. What a wonderful name for a Stoic philosopher. Demetrius, it seems, largely ignored the order to go into exile. So, I quote again, Vespasian commanded that this message should be given to him. You are doing everything to force me to kill you, but I do not slay a barking dog. Well, at least Vespasian knew that Demetrius was a cynic. So that's probably where we stop if we want to give a brief outline of cynicism. It is called Cynicism in a nutshell, and I don't want to turn it into a 3-hour video that includes reading all of the anecdotes from Diogenes Laertius out loud. If you have something to say, I strongly encourage you to leave a comment. Also, don't forget to subscribe, share, like, and well, you can watch this video 5 times. Or 10 times at double speed. Next time, we're gonna talk very briefly again about Stoicism. So, see you soon.